afternoon. It is a pleasure to be able to introduce not one, but two speakers today, both from Prison Fellowship International. Ray Wood, who is in person, is Vice President of Global Impact at Prison Fellowship International. And during her over 20-year career, she has served in the United States Marine Corps as a missionary in Asia and on the pastoral staff of her US-based church. Ray has worked with PFI since 2014 and now oversees the strategic implementation of all global field initiatives. Ray is joined today by Jonathan Derby, who is our online speaker. And I'm so pleased that Ray asked Jonathan to join her today because he oversees PFI's work in an area that Rotarians care deeply about as special advisor for restorative justice. Jonathan is a lawyer by profession who worked for 14 years with organizations in India that help the most vulnerable access justice, first with International Justice Mission to combat sex trafficking and forced prostitution, and then with Council to Secure Justice, an organization based in Delhi that he started to provide legal support and restorative care to children who experience sexual harm. Jonathan now lives in Fresno, California, and teaches restorative justice at the Strauss Institute of Dispute Resolution at Pepperdine University's Caruso School of Law. He recently revised and published Restoring Justice, an important restorative justice textbook. So Ray and Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us today. Rotarians, please give a warm welcome to our guests, and Ray, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Let me start by saying two things. One, we're so honored to be here. We love to talk about Prison Fellowship International. This is our first Rotary event, so this is exciting for us. But I'd also like to say that many of us have experienced trauma imposed by another human being. And because of that, I just want to say what Jonathan and I are going to share with you today may trigger emotion. Our hope, however, is that it triggers hope for you and others that you know that have had similar experiences. But let me tell you about Prison Fellowship International. And so in the spirit of advancing goodwill, peace, and understanding in the world, we're going to share with you our role in those initiatives. And so Prison Fellowship International, our mission is to transform the lives of prisoners. We transform the lives of prisoners, their families, and victims. And we do this through a global network of ministry partners. And I want to pause and I want to talk to you about our global network of ministry partners. PFI is the largest Christian network of prison ministries in the world. That's who we are. And we were founded by a man you may know, you may have heard of. His name is Chuck Colson. He founded Prison Fellowship International in 1979. I'll be around later if you want to talk about Chuck or know more about him. But we've spent the last 43 years, we've been privileged to develop and expand these local, autonomous, indigenous prison ministries in 120 countries. I learned today from past President Bill that Rotary International is the largest volunteer organization in the world in about 170 countries. Is that right? Well, you're much older than we are. So we're right now in 120. And we do that through these local, we call them local affiliates. They're the indigenous guys on the ground. But we also have another set of ministry partners, and these are like-minded international organizations, and they help us deepen our impact in the world. And they provide services or goods, and some of those partners are Bible League International, Biblica, the International Bible Society, or Faith Comes by Hearing, who produces a spectacular audio Bible in about 2,000 languages for free, including gospel films, if you're interested in those guys. But to what end are we partnering with ministry partners? Well, our vision, our big vision as an organization is to break the cycle of crime. And we do that through Jesus's love worldwide. Notice I did not say stop crime. Stopping crime belongs to somebody else. It's this gentleman right over here. No, what we're after is breaking that revolving door of offending, getting caught, getting sentenced, getting released, offending, getting caught, that's the cycle we're looking to break. And we believe we can put a Bible-sized wedge in that revolving door and then reintroduce former offenders as contributing members to society. And so how are we going to do that? Well, we have this beautiful working hypothesis that if we can achieve a tipping point, that's a point of critical mass within a prison system, we can tip that culture for positive change. It's that point where enough people are transformed, they're motivated to be transformed by the love of Jesus, that they trigger a social epidemic for that positive change that then spreads virally throughout that prison system. We believe that tipping point for us is 20%, or 2 million prisoners meaningfully served or meaningfully engaged in 1 year. Now, let me talk to you about meaningful engagement, right? That's not simply a handshake. It's not simply the provision of a hygiene pack. It's not the gift of a Bible or clothes or food, although all of these things are critical supports, especially in the developing world. That's not what we're talking about when we say meaningful engagement. What we're looking to do is create opportunities for these guys to reflect on biblical truths and values that engender awareness of the harm that they've caused, right? I've caused harm, and then understand what's at stake in order to repair that harm that they've caused. And the beginning of that understanding, or that awakening, is hope. It's hope that I can be loved, that I can be forgiven, that redemption is possible, that transformation is possible, that I don't have to be a criminal, I can make different decisions. And so imagine a global impact, a movement. So what we think of ourselves as a movement of global impact, beginning first with the individual, the self, motivated for that positive change, that ripple effect impacting their peers, impacting that closed prison, impacting that prison system. And then as they're released, the impact they have on their families, communities, and their nations. And this is our big vision, to change the world. What you see on the screen here is a map that represents Prison Fellowship International's strategy to accomplish this vision. It's a multi-layered plan. And it starts with expanding our network from 120 countries to over 165. Increasing the number of countries that are implementing quality, credible, evidence-based transformative programs, and then extending those programs into more prisons, deepening the penetration of service to our beneficiaries, and then establishing what we call beachheads, or centers of excellence in key regions of the world, so that we can actually empirically demonstrate. Because you can hear good news stories all the time, but if we can empirically demonstrate this tipping point concept, we can transform culture. And post-release, it's an enduring transformation. But it's more than a numbers game for us. It's not simply about how many prisoners we can touch or serve, although we do have to count them in order to measure progress, but it's also about the quality of service that we can provide to these men and women behind bars, to their families, and to victims. And this is the point where I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Jonathan Derby, whom you really want to hear from. And he's going to share with you how we are weaving these qualitative restorative practices through everything we do at Prison Fellowship International and through everything that our affiliates are doing in their local contexts. So, Jonathan.
Thank you so much, Ray, and it's great to be here with everyone today. Thank you for inviting me. Restorative justice is core to how PFI intends to break the cycle of crime. And if we are going to achieve this very big vision, yes, we need to access more prisons around the world, and we need to reach more people inside these prisons, but we will need more. People who are incarcerated, they will need to decide that they want a different life. And they need support from their families and community groups to stay away from crime. And this is where restorative justice comes in. Often when we think about justice, we think about end results. A person might break the law and commit a crime. For example, they might seriously harm someone. And when we talk about justice, or when we demand justice, often we're focusing on the end result. The person who committed the crime deserves to be punished. Basically, justice means punishment, but a lot of times it's a lot more. Sometimes we need to be supported and believed. That might be important to us. And so restorative justice allows us to look at those kinds of needs. And so I believe it's important that we start thinking about justice differently to incorporate this as a means to an end rather than an end in itself. To do this, though, we need to have a sense of that end or that vision, which we hope justice will achieve. And so I want to talk a little bit about what is our vision of justice or a just community. That's a question. And can we even agree upon that vision? Well, I believe a common vision does exist. And it's not only in Christianity, but it's across faith traditions and belief systems, though it may go by a different name or remain hidden to many people. Restorative justice practitioner and scholar Kay Pranis, she alludes to this vision. She says that a core human need is to be in right relationship with one another. And so in the Judeo-Christian faith tradition, this vision of being in right relationship with one another is represented by the Hebrew concept of shalom. And while we often translate this as peace, it's really much broader than that. Shalom is a flourishing in every dimension: physical, emotional, social, and spiritual. It's a state of interconnectedness where people live in right relationship with one another, the community, creation, and God. And so when describing shalom and justice, I like to use the image of kintsugi Japanese pottery. It's the pottery on the right. So like broken pottery, injustice breaks apart shalom, our connectedness. It distances us from one another and from God. But the kintsugi potter views brokenness as part of that object's history rather than something to hide or discard. So the potter takes the broken pieces, brings them together, and transforms them into something new and more beautiful than before it was broken. And so in the same way, justice should connect us and bind us together. It should lead to stronger relationships within our families, to healthy communities where people sense that they belong and they have opportunities to contribute, especially people who are marginalized and vulnerable, like the people who are incarcerated and ex-prisoners that we often work with. And so as we see it at Prison Fellowship International, the vision of restorative justice is shalom. And so when I speak about restorative justice, I mean a justice that restores shalom. And so this leads to two key principles about restorative justice I want to touch upon. One, that justice is relational and justice heals. So first, justice is relational. It recognizes our interconnectedness. Crime and other types of harm, they're like raindrops that hit water. At the point of impact, it primarily harms the direct victim and the offender, right? But crime and the resulting imprisonment, it has a ripple effect. it also harms the families of victims and prisoners. It erodes a sense of safety and belonging within our neighborhoods. And ultimately, it destabilizes society. So restorative justice looks outside the binary distinction between victim and offender, and it gives space to address all harm that flows from crime. Restorative justice is also inclusive. We invite the primary people who've been impacted by the crime, victims, offenders, and community members, and we just talk about what happened, the crime's impact, and what each party needs, especially the victim, to make things right so that they can move forward with their lives. And this space where the parties meet, it's called an encounter. And so as much as possible, we want the encounter to be physically and emotionally safe so people can freely and authentically share and express their feelings. And this need for safety, it's also a reason why restorative processes need to be voluntary and people voluntarily choose to participate. They can't be forced. And this also means that the people or person who committed the harm, they need to acknowledge and take responsibility for the harm, at least to some extent, as a condition to participate. And then finally, a fundamental value that should permeate restorative encounters is respect. So the participants need to respect one another in these spaces. And what I mean is that we need to come into those spaces and recognize that person's humanity, that each person is a child of God with inherent dignity and worth, regardless of who they are, race, gender, sexual identity, disability, age, faith, lack of faith, or what they have done, right? Good or bad. Second, justice heals and repairs harm that results from crime. And this paradigm of justice is much different than the dominant paradigm of criminal justice that we are more familiar with. And I'd like to use two sets of questions to contrast the differences between these paradigms. In the dominant justice paradigm, we ask, what law was broken? Who broke the law and what do they deserve? And it's all these questions are almost exclusively focused on the offender as lawbreaker. The criminal justice system or the dominant system, it's primarily adversarial, where the parties oppose one another. And if a person is determined guilty, the court imposes punishment, generally imprisonment. And the culture that dominates prison sentences or systems is punitive and coercive. So restorative justice, it challenges this pattern of thinking. And from a restorative paradigm, we ask, who was harmed? How do we repair the harm? And who has the responsibility to repair the harm? And so restorative justice, it recognizes that crime ultimately harms people and relationships. And so it focuses on that harm and what the people or parties need, especially victims, to go on and move forward with their lives. And so, like I mentioned, there are three main parties or stakeholders impacted by crime, right? The victim, offender, and the community, and each have needs that arise from crime. And so just very briefly, I'll touch upon that. First, the victims, they have a need for healing. And this is really the primary focus of restorative counters, because victims are primarily the people that have been harmed. And so they have a main need to, as much as possible, heal and recover from the crime. But remember the ripple effect. We also look at the needs of the families of victims, families of the offenders, as well as others in the community. Second, restorative encounters empower people who commit harm to make amends. In fact, at the center of restorative justice is to create space where the person who committed the harm can take responsibility for what they've done and then take active steps to make things right. And so when people who commit crime make amends for wrongdoing, in a way they redeem themselves and are brought back into right relationship with community. And ideally with the people that they've harmed, although this isn't necessary, and it might not even be wise, but that would be an ideal situation. And finally, community members need healthy and safe families and communities. And in restorative justice, the community really plays a supportive role, right? We walk with and support victims as they recover from crime. We also support prisoners during their incarceration and as they rejoin the community after they are released. And clearly, the family is also an important source of support. They're a core community group, but community groups might also include, support groups like Alcoholics Anonymous, businesses, Rotary Club, and faith-based communities. So Shalom is our vision of justice, where we live in right relationship with one another, with God, and with creation. And restorative justice advances us towards our vision of Shalom. And alternatively, injustice distances us or blocks us from that vision, right? So restorative justice is most effective when all three stakeholders come together in an encounter to meet the core needs and repair harm. And the main stakeholder needs are the victim need for healing, the offender need to make amends, and the community need for relational health and safety. So programs can be restorative even if they only meet a single stakeholder need, though they may be much less restorative. But the process gains greater depth and meaning as these three stakeholders connect with one another, build trust, and when necessary, repair harm and reconcile relationships. So how does this relate to our work in the prison context? First, the offender becomes a prisoner. They are the people that we are working with. They still have a need to make amends, but they also need to prepare themselves to reintegrate and return into the community. So PFI has 2 in-prison programs that help people who are incarcerated take responsibility for their lives and turn away from a prison criminal lifestyle. The Prisoner's Journey introduces prisoners to Jesus, and they begin to see themselves as God's beloved children, rather than as criminals or bad people. And the Sycamore Tree Project teaches people who are incarcerated that restorative justice principles, and it increases their empathy for the people they've harmed, including their own family members. Second, the victim becomes family, or is the family, because family members are secondary victims of crime. A person's incarceration impacts the family, spouses, parents, children, and in fact, it often compounds the struggles that families often deal with in life. And so PFI has a program called the Child's Journey that supports families, including children, and it provides for their safety, health, education, and spiritual care needs. And it keeps them connected with their incarcerated family member. And these connections are important because almost always, people who are incarcerated, they will leave prison. And a key factor that keeps people from reoffending are those supportive relationships within their families and communities. And finally, we substitute community with volunteers. And PFI's volunteer network, really, it's the lifeblood of our work. And often ex-prisoners who have graduated from our programs, they become volunteers themselves and witnesses to the program's impact. Volunteers facilitate our programs, build relationships with people who are incarcerated and their family members, and provide community support when they leave prison. And so hopefully you're beginning to see how our work with prisoners, their families, and volunteers fit within a restorative justice framework. And the more that we make these connections, build relationships, and when necessary, repair harm, the more restorative our work becomes. And as Ray mentioned, this becomes meaningful engagement that contributes towards breaking the cycle of crime. And this brings us back to our vision to break the cycle of crime and restore lives worldwide through Jesus's love. Our in-prison and family-focused programs, they complement one another, and together they become more restorative and contribute towards breaking the cycle of crime. Research tells us that 2 important factors keep prisoners from reoffending. They are when they experience a changed self-identity and when they have strong supportive relationships to rely upon when they leave prison. And so our programs foster these outcomes. They're transformative because they change lives and they strengthen families and communities. They restore shalom. Thank you, everyone.
So does anybody have questions?
I have a question for you, particularly regarding the global impact of the work that you do. I can sort of follow it within the framework, let's see, of the United States. But you mentioned that you are engaged in over 120 countries. How do you manage to work in some cultures where the philosophy may be different, even towards the victims, toward the offenders, and where the communities themselves may be at a different point? So I think it's very daunting, and I'd love to know how you manage this.
Jonathan, shall I take this one?
Sure, go ahead, Ray.
Okay, really great question. And we do work in some hard places, but we've been building these networks for over 40 years. So that's one. And I'll say predominantly, especially in Africa and our Latin America, Caribbean region, we have incredible success. We have open access, and we have many of our prison institutions that actually depend on our prison fellowships and other NGOs to help them transition from that punitive space to a more restorative or correctional space. But our hard spaces would be Europe, which is largely secular, and Middle East, North Africa. One of the ways that we are, and Asia as well, Asia Pacific. And so we gain market entry very slowly in those regions, but it's one of the reasons empirical research is so important to us, because when we can present to a prison system or a ministry of justice evidence that these kinds of faith-based programs are actually changing behavior, that identity transformation that Jonathan referred to, are actually changing behavior, and the impact of that reduces costs on a prison system, we find that they begin to open their doors just a little bit. That works for us in Europe. But again, Middle East, we're just starting to break ground there. It's one of our most significant focuses over the next 5 years, as well as Asia Pacific. And we do face a lot of challenges, and we're just navigating those very carefully. So not a perfect answer, but does that help? Okay.
Yeah, I could say one thing too. Like Ray mentioned, our offices around the world are indigenous, and they really grow from a grassroots ground up level. And so it's able to contextualize the work as well in that way.
Yeah.
I have 2 questions. The first one is that my son was murdered about 20 years ago, and it ruined my whole life. I'm still suffering today. You don't never heal. Trust me, if you lose a child, you never heal from that. Number one, when my son was murdered and they put my son into, he was laying on a gurney, and the minister came over to me and he said to me, "Tell the Lord to Jesus, my son." I didn't want to hear that. I don't want to hear that. You mean Jesus had something to do with this? I just didn't want to hear it at the time. And so people like me, and I've been approached by restorative justice people, have a problem that I don't want to talk to the person that murdered my son. And not only did he murder my son, he murdered 2 other people. And so you talk about a whole rippling effect of all the lives and people that he impacted. I just me and a lot of people I talk to that had their children murdered. They don't want to talk to people either that had murdered their children. The second question I have is when you say you want to restore and you're going around the world and you want to tell people to to Jesus. Suppose the person is Muslim. Suppose the person is a Jewish person. I mean, I don't understand how you would impose your belief and get a Jewish person to turn your belief over to Jesus when that's not their faith, or a Muslim person and that's not their faith. Those are my two questions.
Jonathan, shall I start?
Sure, go ahead, Ray.
Sure, I didn't, first, I'm so sorry for your loss. I can't imagine. So thank you for sharing. I didn't catch your first question, but to your second question, we're not proselytizers. So none of our programs are meant to convert from one faith to another, and all of our programs are open to everyone regardless of faith. What we're presenting is a demonstration of love, and we do that through our biblical principles, which in this case happen to be rooted in Jesus. And so we don't ask anyone to do that. Yeah, I didn't catch that one.
You said that what you do is when you go around the world, you get people to turn their lives over to Jesus and restorative justice. That's what you said, right? And that's why my question was, why would you how can you turn a person's religion to what they may not believe in? They may be an atheist. That's my first. Second question. My first question is that people like me and people have had their child murdered, and there's never any restorative justice. So to tell me to turn it over to Jesus and forgive this guy, it ruined my whole life. My entire life was changed because of that. Okay, my family's life has been ruined because of that. My son's friends' lives were ruined, right? So there's a lot of people like us that say no. Okay.
Sure. Jonathan.
Yeah, no, again, thanks for sharing your experience. I think what's important with as far as restorative justice, it's really, when I talked about victim healing, you're absolutely right. There's some things that a person who's been harmed, like yourself, you'll never be able to heal from. And so what restorative justice does look at, though, is to what can be done. What are some of the needs that victims might have, and how can we meet those needs? And so, there are programs like in restorative justice context with people who have had family members murdered. They have what it's called the victim offender dialogue, where people who want to meet the person that committed the murder, they want to have questions answered. They want to express the pain that they've experienced. They want to, just whatever needs that they have through that conversation, they can help meet those needs. And so that might be one way in restorative process that can help meet needs. And I do also want to say that restorative justice, it doesn't necessarily, I'm not saying that we eliminate a punitive process at all. But what I am saying is, how can we look at the crime and what's happened from a broader, more restorative perspective? And really, this is separate from kind of the faith conversation that you mentioned as well. It's kind of just really how are we dealing with the pain and the hurt that the victims especially have experienced?
We, in honor of our speakers, we will plant a tree. And this is a certificate that just describes it.
Thank you so very much.
We'll mail the one to your colleague. And we are so sophisticated, or the Park Service is that you will get the GPS coordinates for your tree when it's planted.
Thanks so very much.